The logical problem of the Trinity is an argument often used against Christians to show that the Trinity is an incoherent doctrine. The first premise is that the Father is God, the second that the Son is God, the third that the Holy Spirit is God. Premises 4 through 6 say that the persons are not one another, and the seventh is that there is one God. For many Christians, they'll be looking at these premises and wondering where the problem even is. In order to make it more clear, we first have to talk about something called Leibnizian identity. Leibnizian identity, sometimes called strict identity, holds that X is identical to Y if and only if X has every property of Y. Said in a simpler way, if everything that can be said of X can be said of Y, then they are identical in this strict Leibnizian sense. A good example of this would be that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. If you have Leibnizian identity, then you don't have two things. As in the case of Peter Parker and Spider-Man, you actually only have one thing that goes by two names. So do Christians mean Leibnizian identity when we say that the Father is God? Well, this would already run into problems because if two things have Leibnizian identity to a third thing, then they must have Leibnizian identity to one another. So if the Father has Leibnizian identity with God, and so does the Son, then the Father would be identical to the Son, and that's modalism, not to mention that it would contradict premises 4 through 6. Historically, have Christians meant strict identity when saying that the three persons are God? Certainly not. In the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, predications that distinguish the persons are clearly made. Of the Son, it is said that he is the only begotten Son of God, born of the Father before all ages. Similarly, the Holy Spirit is said to proceed from the Father and the Son. So Christians have not and cannot mean strict identity for premises 1 through 3. In that case, what do we mean? Let's cover a few proposed solutions and then my preferred solution. Some want to say that the Father is God means something similar to Bob is human. Bob is an instance of humanity, and the persons are three instances of divinity. On this reading, there are various ideas of what it would mean to be the one God, some arguing that the persons work together in such a way that they should be called one. A concern with this view is that normally three instances of a universal essence results in three of whatever that essence is of. In the case of humanity, three instances are three humans. So if the persons relate to the divine nature in the same way, why are there not three gods, but only one? Another attempted solution is to reject Leibnizian identity and say that identity doesn't require that two things share all the same properties. Let's illustrate this with what I'll call the logical problem of Bob. The premises of the argument are similar to the LPT. Premise 1, 1-year-old Bob is Bob. Premise 2, 20-year-old Bob is Bob. Premise 3, 1-year-old Bob is not 20-year-old Bob. Premise 4, there is one Bob. If we mean classical identity with premises 1 through 3, it seems that 1-year-old Bob and 20-year-old Bob cannot be identical because they have different properties, most obviously their age. There are many proposed solutions to this problem, not all of which require relative identity, but here's one solution that utilizes relative identity that you might find intuitive. Premises 1 and 2 will remain the same, but rather than strict identity, 1-year-old Bob is Bob refers to relative identity. Premises 3 and 4 will clarify this. Premise 3, 1-year-old Bob is not the same age as 20-year-old Bob. However, premise 4, 1-year-old Bob is the same Bob as 20-year-old Bob. They are identical with respect to Bobness, but not with respect to age. This retains the intuitive idea that you have one Bob and not two. To apply this relative identity logic to the Trinity, we would say that the Father is God refers to relative identity. Then we can say in premise 4 that the Father is the same God, but not the same person as the Son. Likewise with the other persons. Since they are all the same God, there is no contradiction with premise 7 that there is one God and not three. In my opinion, we're getting closer, but there are still concerns. Identity is a fundamental law of logic, like the law of non-contradiction. Some relative identity theorists reject that Leibnizian identity, the standard view of classical logic, exists at all. To many, rejecting that strict identity exists is as ridiculous as rejecting that contradictions exist. Would you be willing to adopt a view that contradictions don't exist, or there are only relative contradictions? But does someone have to reject this law of classical logic wholesale to affirm that the persons are the same God but distinct persons? I don't think so, any more than difficult situations for the law of non-contradiction would commit one to rejecting that law. For example, what if I told you that I died yesterday and that I did not die yesterday? This seems like a straightforward contradiction, but what if by these statements I mean that I died yesterday in a video game and I did not die yesterday in reality? Would you call this a relative contradiction, or say that I have to reject the law of non-contradiction to affirm it? Similarly, what if I told you I want to go to the buffet and I do not want to go to the buffet? Again, this looks like a straightforward contradiction. How about if I then clarify that as a father I want to go to the buffet, and as an athlete I do not want to go to the buffet because I am cutting weight? These examples could pejoratively be called relative contradictions, but I think it would be more fair to just say that they aren't contradictions, but rather properly qualified statements that are not contradictory. Is there a similar way we can qualify the premises in the logical problem of the Trinity to avoid contradiction or rejection of strict identity? I think so. What is needed is some relationship of sameness by which the persons can be called the same God that is not Leibnizian identity. Recall that this isn't a rejection of Leibnizian identity as a valid way of describing things, but rather a clarification that the Father is God is not describing this strict kind of identity, but rather some other relationship. To illustrate one type of sameness relationship that would solve this problem, albeit one that cannot be applied to the Trinity, let's look at what I will call the logical problem of parts. To mirror the LPT, we can say that San Antonio is Texas, Dallas is Texas, and Houston is Texas. These cities are not one another, and there is only one Texas. San Antonio as Texas may sound like a strange formulation, but keep in mind that we say things like, I am moving to Texas all the time, even though only a part of Texas rather than the whole is being indicated. There is an important sense in which San Antonio is Texas, and this has the same logical issue that the LPT does if we assume classical identity as the relationship of 1 through 3. Of course, it's apparent to us that the is there refers to a part-to-whole relationship, not strict identity, so there is no contradiction, properly understood. To be exceedingly clear, this part-to-whole relationship does not work for the Trinity for multiple reasons, not least of which is that it makes each person not fully God, but it helps to illustrate that we need some sort of relationship by which the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit can rightly be called God and fully God that is nonetheless not strict identity. St. Thomas Aquinas suggested subsistent relations as such a relationship. Taking inspiration from Aristotle, Aquinas said that relation is simply reference to another, and this reference to another comes with mutual opposition. An example would be that I am a father to my son. The mutual opposition is that my son is a son to me. Similarly, 7 is greater than 3 requires that 3 is less than 7. For humans, fatherhood and sonhood require some change in at least one of the things being related, but that is not strictly necessary, Aquinas argues, for all types of relationships. He then says that since no change or realization of potential is possible in God, these relations are subsistent relations, or relations that just exist in God's essence necessarily. Although all analogies will be imperfect, try to imagine this. Think of an angle made of 2 rays. This angle is analogous to the Father. The end of one of those rays generates another ray and an angle, analogous to the Son, and the meeting of the final 2 rays generates another angle, analogous to the Holy Spirit. Tracing these angles and imagining the area inside the triangle as the divine essence, all of these angles contain the fullness of the divine essence, but are mutually opposed and distinguished from one another. What is happening within God that is analogous to these rays? We must speculate, as there's an element of mystery here, but let's first work through this thought experiment. If I'm thinking about Bob, Bob is unchanged. The same is true for God. Though a bit trickier, God is unchanged by creating Bob. But what about God thinking about God? What sort of relation obtains there? St. Augustine theorized these relations in terms of love, rather than thinking. He said that the Father is like the lover, the Son like the beloved, and the Holy Spirit like the action of love that they share. A more modern formulation of this idea is by Dr. Robert Kuhns from the University of Texas. Building off Augustine, he posits the Father is God as knower of God. The Son is God, known by God, and the Holy Spirit is God as knower and known by God. This gives a further explanation behind Aquinas' idea of subsistent relations, but raises an interesting objection. Couldn't any thinking creature be described in these terms? Bob surely knows himself and is known by himself. Why isn't Bob Trinitarian? Once again, we'll have to speculate and shouldn't expect to be able to understand every detail of God's inner life, but it seems simple enough to say that when creatures know themselves, only a dim shadow of themselves is present in their act of knowing, whereas God would know himself fully and perfectly. This self-image, so to speak, would contain the fullness of the divine essence and be aptly described as a subsistent relation, since God must know himself and be known by himself necessarily. To resolve the LPT using these tools, we can say that premises 1 through 3 indicate that the persons are subsistent relations of the divine nature. This is properly indicated by the statement, is God, because these subsistent relations contain the fullness of the divine essence, but are nonetheless not strictly identical to the divine essence. Premises 4 through 6 can be understood as statements of strict non-identity, since the persons have distinguishing features, namely their processions. Lastly, premise 7 states that there is one God, which is the divine nature. Let me know your thoughts, and if you learned anything in the comments, and thanks for watching.